We negate with one observation. The national debt is irrelevant, as County in 2017 indicates that investors are not remotely worried about the debt, and it is the least of the country's worries. Further explaining that the United States is headed toward a technological revolution with the help from developments in internet, robotics, and automation. He concludes that these advancements in the capacity to create would spur unprecedented wealth creation, making the debt negligible. Mandel in 2017 quantifies advances in technology are about to open 4/5 of the economy to transformation into productivity powerhouses. Federal revenues will go up $3.9 trillion to go to cutting the debt. Because of this confidence in technology, O'Brien in 2018 explains that Treasury bonds are in high demand and will always be in high demand, further concluding that selling bonds decreases economic growth. It is for the aforementioned reason that the House Budget Committee in 2017 concludes that the best strategy to decrease the deficit is to grow the economy, as 0.1 percentage point increase in economic growth reduces the deficit by $270 billion. Contention 1 is big austerity energy. Reducing the debt is harmful because the U.S. must run budget surpluses to avoid adding to it. This will require deep cuts, as the CBO in 2018 finds that the deficit hit $804 billion this year and will permanently breach $1 trillion in 2020 unless Congress cuts spending. Critically, Zelzer in 2017 observed that the GOP wants to cut federal healthcare and anti-poverty programs because of the deficit. While the right usually encounters backlash whenever they try to attack the federal benefits, cutting budgets in the name of deficit reduction offers a less toxic mechanism for achieving the same goal. This approach will dominate debt reduction. As Johnson in 2017 writes that politicians, Democratic to conservative, complain that America is running out of money when it comes to helping minorities, but this sentiment disappears when talking about the military. Matthews in 2017 confirms, finding that Republicans want to cut health programs by 30% by 2027 and cut food stamps and anti-poverty programs by 15%. After a surplus is reached, funds must be reallocated to pay down the debt, further exacerbating these severe cuts. The impact is lives. Matthews explains that the proposed $140 billion cuts to food stamps would cut 10 million people off. The CBPP in 2018 finds federal funding cuts for Medicaid and the repeal of individual mandate lead to a total coverage loss of over 20 million. This is deadly, as Himmelstein in 2017 finds that being uninsured leads to a 17% increase in the risk of death. Contention 2 is infrastructure. The ASCE in 2017 finds that the nation's overall infrastructure is in a stage of deterioration and at a strong risk of failure. Thus, Bernstein in 2017 writes it's time to redirect infrastructure to support jobs and businesses that make our cities more productive and bring jobs and economic vitality to all communities, even the poorest. Fortunately, Whalen in 2018 argues that there is growing bipartisan support for a massive infrastructure series called the Green New Deal, a fiscal stimulus program that invests $7 trillion into green infrastructure throughout the United States. This is why Levitz in 2017 concluded that Trump is beginning to signal infrastructure as a point of compromise between Democrats and Republicans. There are two impacts. The first is promoting growth. Meyer in 2018 argues that the Green New Deal provides economic stimulus that can successfully jumpstart the U.S. economy. Romero and Jones in 2018 expands, writing that the Green New Deal will provide jobs in green technology, lower the cost of living for low-income families, and open millions of jobs in construction and infrastructure maintenance. These jobs are uniquely beneficial, as Bivens in 2014 explained that jobs created are disproportionately middle and high wage. Bottom wage employment is half that of the rest of the economy. Thus, CNT in 2017 finds that new infrastructure strategies reduce the population living in poverty by 25%. Critically, Stupak in 2018 concludes that the deficit-neutral infrastructure budgets are largely ineffective at decreasing the unemployment rate. Second is green technology. The benefits of green technology are virtually endless, as a study from the Journal of Environmental Management asserts that green infrastructure has a laundry list of avenues to combat climate change, including carbon sequestration and the absorption of air pollution. The study ultimately concludes that green infrastructure would overwhelmingly help vulnerable social groups. The threat of climate change is existential, as Borschmann in 2016 indicates that climate instability and massive sea level rises creates an environment that humans cannot adapt to, threatening extinction. Green infrastructure is the only meaningful solution to the ever-present threat of climate change, with the JPEB explaining that due to the economic sustainability of carbon capture systems, they are the single best technologies to drastically reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, leading to 1/5 of emissions reduction within 2050, thus negate.
Can we see the support for the Green New Deal?
Sure. Trump wants to
We're sorry, if Trump has to be, like, if Trump is not talking about this specific plan, then that's fine, but if he is, then...
He's not talking about this.
Okay, then,
Yeah, just the other.
then the part, like, whatever we're talking about.
I'm going to kind of there's the compromise evidence, and then there's the evidence about it being popular and bipartisan.
Okay, we'll start there. All right, 10 seconds.
Yeah, what was that bill? What was that bill, bro? What was that bill? What was that bill? The Stone Age?
Not my case.
Two silver. Two bucks.
Is everyone ready? Okay. We affirm our first contention is preventing entitlement cuts. Currently, spending on entitlement programs is unsustainable and is blowing up federal debt levels. David Schornbrod, a professor of New York Law School, writes in 2018 that after averaging 35% of national income from the mid-1950s to 2008, the national debt has surged to 78% today and is projected to reach 100% within the decade and 200% by 2050. Even these scary estimates rest on rosy assumptions. No new military or economic crises, and creditors willing to accept record low interest rates from a government heading towards a debt crisis. The cause of this coming debt deluge is no mystery. Social Security and Medicare are projected to run a staggering $82 trillion cash deficit over the next 30 years. We are adding 74 million retiring baby boomers to a system that provides Medicare recipients with benefits 3 times as large as their lifetime contributions and pays Social Security benefits typically exceeding lifetime contributions. The massive increase in entitlement spending means that these programs will soon run out of money. Schornbrod furthers that the Social Security Trust Fund is currently in deficit, yet will receive enough general revenue transfers from its trust fund to pay full benefits until 2034. Medicare's trust fund will go belly up in 2026. When time and money run out, these programs will face massive cuts that will damage people's lives and the economy. Using just one example of Social Security, Gary Koenig finds in a 2013 Public Policy Institute report that without any changes to these programs, Social Security benefits will have to be reduced across the board by about 25% in 2033. Reducing benefits would have serious impact on the economy by damaging employment, retail, and other spending. Reducing benefits by 25% across the board could cost the U.S. economy about 2.3 million jobs and about $349 billion in economic output. The U.S. government needs to prioritize reducing debt and putting these programs on sure footing, and we need to start now. David Wessel of Brookings Institute explains in 2019, the longer we wait to put the federal budget on a sustainable course, the bigger and more abrupt the changes in government benefits and taxes will have to be. Changes are inevitable, but the sooner we start, the more gradual and gentle they can be. One political reality is that Congress, with good reason, is reluctant to cut benefits abruptly for current retirees and other beneficiaries. Major changes to Social Security, for instance, are facing over decades. This means that the blow would be softened if we started now rather than waiting. Contention 2 is crowding out. The CBO explains in 2018 that large federal budget deficits over the long term would reduce investments. If the government borrowed more money, a greater amount of household and business saving would be used to buy treasury securities, thus crowding out private investment. With less investment in capital goods such as factories and computers, workers will be less productive. Because productivity growth is the main driver of growth in people's real compensation, decreased investment also would reduce average compensation per hour, making people less inclined to work. This trend is empirically confirmed by Huang of the University of Geneva in 2017, who, using the data from nearly 550,000 firms in 69 countries between 1998 and 2014, shows empirically that higher levels of government debt are associated with lower private investment. Lower investment in consumer consumption will have large negative effects on the economy. According to the St. Louis Fed in 2017, household spending fuels 83% of total economic growth. The CBO implicates that the effect of crowding out on the U.S. economy in 2010, writing that real GDP per person would be about 6% lower in 2025 and 15% lower in 2035 than it would be under the stable economic conditions with no crowding out. These crowding out effects would be detrimental for employment, as Sanchez of the St. Louis Fed writes that a 1 percentage point decrease in GDP has been associated with a slightly less than 2 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate. Thus, we affirm.
To manifest. You say we're going to have to cut social spending in your first contention. How long will it take before we're forced to do that?
Our evidence indicates that Medicare and Social Security will both have literally no money in the next year.
How
Ask you a question.
1 second. Why can't you just increase the debt ceiling to compensate?
What do you mean?
Like, why can't you just take on more debt in order to compensate for interest
I mean,
rates?
look, like we can get into a borrowing argument,
Yeah,
but
sure.
I've answered your question. So, can I ask you a question? So, who's our president?
Donald Trump
Like, what does
Well,
Donald Trump not like?
doesn't like a lot of things.
Yeah, green
Mexico.
tech. He doesn't like green tech. He doesn't like the environment.
I don't think he doesn't like green tech. I don't think he likes
No,
regulations
Donald
on
Trump
business, like
absolutely does
carbon
not like the
taxes.
environment. Donald Trump thinks that climate change is a myth.
I'm
Yeah.
sure he does, but that doesn't mean he's not willing to compromise on
But
infrastructure.
that's not true. So your evidence, you are telling me that your evidence says that Republicans and Democrats are agreeing to pass a Green New Deal, which is like an infrastructure bill, right?
Our evidence indicates that people and voters are changing their opinions, and that ultimately
Wait,
spills out.
voters. Wait,
Yeah.
why does that spill over? What evidence do you read that says that spills
Because we live in a democracy, so that means that the people in government represent what.
I mean, if that were true, then Trump wouldn't have been elected to office, because Trump, and through the whole campaign trail, said climate change isn't real, climate change isn't real. But
Yeah.
what you just told me is that Trump
Well,
is
there's been a
president.
change since
Obviously, wait, how has there been a change since then?
Because 53% of conservative
Wait,
Republicans
so
support.
since between now and the last election, you're telling me that suddenly opinions on climate change have changed?
Not necessarily, but what I am saying is that 53% of conservative Republicans are a fan of the Green New Deal. And what that means is that there's no political fallout for Republicans who end up endorsing
Well,
green.
that's
green
fine,
infrastructure.
but
That's
Trump
ultimately why they
still
do it.
won't pursue green tech. Like,
I don't
doesn't
think that
really
Trump
matter.
is ethically opposed to green tech. I
I
just
mean,
don't.
he doesn't think it's he doesn't think climate
I'm
change
sure
is
he
real, so
doesn't
why
think
would
it's
he care?
necessary, but insofar as he knows that
Like
it's
Trump,
necessary in
well,
order
no,
for him
actually,
to pass an
like Trump is,
infrastructure plan.
the type of pro-growth policies that Trump is pursuing is things like bringing coal jobs back to places like West Virginia. That's indicative that he A, does not give two shits about green tech, but B, obviously wants to do things that hurt the
He
environment.
wants to do things that increase the economy, and if we can find a sustainable
which
way to
harm
do
the
that,
environment, in the environment. Because he doesn't,
No.
he just doesn't think it's an issue. Like he thinks it's made up.
I get that he thinks it's an
thinks
issue, but he
coal jobs
knows
are-
that in order to pass infrastructure legislation, he's going to have to make compromises specifically about green technology. Because Democrats like Chuck Schumer have explicitly drawn the
Then
line
why
on this
hasn't it
issue.
happened yet?
What?
Why haven't they passed an infrastructure bill yet? Republicans control the
Was the
House
government
and the
shut down?
Senate. The Republicans control the
Was it shut
House
down?
for the last 2 years. The Republicans control the House and the Senate before the shutdown. No infrastructure bill passed.
Yeah,
Now Democrats
well,
are in control.
the-
Why would
The Green New
there
Deal
be
was
more?
proposed after the midterm elections.
It's gonna start at the bottom of our case, adding on another. Is everyone ready? You good? Recognize that if you necessarily prioritize debt reduction, we would argue that infrastructure bills as a whole become more expensive. That is the opportunity cost. Even generic infrastructure bills cost trillions of dollars. If you prioritize debt reduction, you can't have infrastructure in both. That's ultimately why we would win the debate, because we tell you that recessions are non-unique. Both sides agree that recessions occur as part of the business cycle, thus we have to try and solve them and mitigate the effects. We do so the best, because the impending recession hits, we would lose millions of jobs. For example, in 2008, we lost 8.7 million jobs. Funding money into infrastructure would be a solution to this problem, as the McKinsey Institute finds that infrastructure spending would create 1.5 million jobs. These jobs are uniquely beneficial for two reasons. The first is because the Bivens evidence analyzes and concludes that these jobs are twice as likely to be high-paying compared to the economy-wide average. The second reason is because the Austin evidence indicates that these jobs go to those who need them the most, at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, with him furthering that these jobs are crucial and being in a step in the right direction to reduce the employment gap between minority and white communities. What this ultimately means is we decrease income inequality, and historically, when you analyze recessions, there have been large spikes of income inequality before every recession. We would tell you mitigate the effects with the people who are hurt the most. But that being said, recognize that it is for these two reasons that Gibson 14 explains that expanding infrastructure projects would increase the level of wealth held at the bottom quintile by 147%. This is why long-term our CNT evidence corroborates that infrastructure spending has empirically reduced poverty by 25%. The University of Maryland quantifies that infrastructure investments added as much as $3 for every $1 spent, and these benefits were magnified in times of recessions. If you believe that recessions occur, you ought to vote for infrastructure. Now let's go into their case. Their first contention talks about entitlement cuts. Recognize the only world in which you ever cut programs is a world in which you change the way the government works. Recognize historically we have never prioritized reducing the debt reduction. That's why all of our spending budgets and discretionary spending has increased since the debt has increased. What this ultimately means is there is no link between government debt and government spending. That's why the only link to austerity comes when you vote for the act. If you think these programs are super important, we would argue the only world in which they get cut is through our first contention about austerity. Extend the Johnson evidence, which indicates that the Republicans right now want to look for an excuse to cut Medicare. And Democratic Noah does a good job of pointing out why Trump is a bad president. Well, he wants to take away Medicare, and we would tell you that prioritizing debt reduction gives him an excuse to do so, and if you even cut off Medicare completely, you still wouldn't meaningfully reduce the debt, but even more so, that impacts 10 million people who are heightened at a risk of debt. Ultimately, this means if these 10 million people don't have access to these food stamps in times of recessions, there's no multiplier effect, which pushes them into recession even more. That's why we tell you that you ought not to cut at all. The debt doesn't matter long term. The second response is the cross-applying the observation. We would tell you that we are at the verge of a technological revolution. That's our TAMI evidence. What this ultimately means is our Mandela evidence concludes that automation could generate up to $4 trillion in 1 year. Ultimately, these revenues generated from the tech revolution could be used to offset spending. Historically, it's what we've done. But then, go on to their second contention, they talk about interest rates. It's also referenced in their first contention. We would tell you that overall, John TAMI concludes that although the debt has increased 30-fold in the past 30 years, interest rates actually declined by 8%. You prefer this evidence for two reasons. A, it is indicative of a broad trend of the past 30 years. But B, it also tells you that although interest rates may be increasing in the short term, in the long term, they would level out. That's why, although the debt has increased, our interest rates have decreased substantially. Then, let's go into their arguments where they talk about crowding out. This doesn't make much sense because Trishka Snyder of the William Patterson University in 2012 finds that empirically the increased economic growth and investment from tax cuts or spending increases outweighs any marginal decrease in the investment from crowding out. Second, Kevin Edkins of the Tax Foundation in 2017 finds that government borrowing does not affect interest rates because foreign investors simply buy American debt rather than private investors in the United States. Third, Neil Buchanan of George Washington University in 2012 writes that the crowding out effect assumes that the private sector uses resources more effectively than the government, but in reality, government spending can be more productive since a lot of government spending, like infrastructure, supports the private sector. This is a link in to our second contention and the overview. That's why Matthew said that the Conversation writes in 2012 that empirically increased government borrowing isn't the reason why people are investing more into treasury bonds or corporate bonds, but rather treasury bonds are always more attractive because they are less risky. What this fundamentally means is that A, the decision-making calculus of investors doesn't change regardless of which way you vote, but B, inherently you can turn the young men because if they were to shift into the private market, it would create bubbles. For example, that's what caused the 2008 recession. There was bubbles through speculative private investment. We would tell you that government spending on infrastructure is the best impact on the ground because it solves for all of their harms without even having to cut spending.
Okay, can we see evidence that automation creates $4 trillion a year?
And the Schneider, the growth and tax cuts.
Wait, sorry, Sri, where does it say per year? Where does it say per year?
It's not per year.
Oh, it's total.
Yeah.
And can I see the Schneider?
Oh, yeah. Just that first one right there. Yeah, Snyder. Snyder, not Schneider.
Also, it's about 25 seconds a minute. going to start on my case. All right, is everyone ready? Cool. Let's start on my first contention. My opponents say that the world in which we cut entitlements is a world in which we try to reduce the debt. Our second contention outweighs this harm, because what we say is that the crowded effect will reduce GDP per capita by 15%. As people get poorer, they rely more on social services, and conversely, as people get richer, they rely less and less on social services, meaning that even if they cut the funding for social services, we still see that the benefits are on net good because people don't need to rely on them. Now let's go to my second contention. So the first response my opponents read is the Schneider evidence that says that the increase for growth from tax cuts can't cancel it out. Three responses. First, on an evidentiary basis, our CBO analysis is probably a lot better. Schneider is just sort of saying this could happen, but CBO analyzes the effects and the offsets of tax and still finds that on net, every $1 increase in the deficit, on net leads to a 30 cents drop in private investment. So on an evidentiary basis, we're probably ahead. But two, on the warrant basis, we're also ahead, because they say the government spending could put the money back into the economy. But most spending is being paid on the interest, as my opponents themselves point out. And third, they say that tax cuts could solve. But most recently, tax cuts, like the Trump tax cuts, go toward the wealthy and decrease things like capital gains, not towards a foreign investors or towards average Joes, most people who buy the bonds. Then the next response they say is that the borrowers are all foreign. That's not true. Two responses. So first off, a lot of borrowers are American. Like, for example, my dad has bonds, and the fact that he owns bonds means that he cannot buy a car or pay down our mortgage. But the second thing is that even if foreign investors are investing, they're deciding between buying U.S. bonds or investing in U.S. companies like Apple. So the trade-off is either they invest in companies or they invest in bonds. We still get the offense. But then they say from Bush that the private sector is worse than infrastructure. I will explain why infrastructure is actually worse than the private sector. But even so, the CBO still does the comparative analysis and finds there was a 15% drop in GDP per capita. Private investment is better in this case. Then they say that it won't change the risk. Our argument is simply that when they buy more bonds and they raise the interest rate, when the federal government issues more bonds, people buy more bonds, they can't invest in the private sector. Then finally they say it's good because of bubbles. There's no analysis done on this argument. They give the 08 recession. The 08 recession happened in a time of rising debt, which just proves their argument. But on a logical basis, people who buy bonds are not going to immediately switch to high risk derivatives. They're going to switch to other relatively stable things like investing in stable companies. Now let's go to their case. So on their observation about AI. So the first problem is that our credit argument takes this argument out. Because if there's less private investment, there's also less investment in things like AI. So if we win that argument, we win the AI argument. But even if they win AI, there's two reasons why AI won't actually deliver the benefits they talk about. It won't deliver tax benefits. Because even if there's more taxable income, one, taxes are going down right now. The current trajectory of economic policy is tax cuts, which means that the taxable income still goes down. But two, AI is targeted towards the wealthy, because wealthy companies can use AI much more effectively. And as the wealth gap grows and grows, it means that over time, the income inequality rises. And income inequality rises, more rich people get in control of the government. For example, that Washington State has the lowest taxes in the country. Not so coincidentally, that is also where Bill Gates lives and where he controls most of the state senate. So income inequality links into taxes. The higher income inequality gets, the lower taxes get. Now let's get to their argument on austerity. So the big response here is that if we win our second contention, we also win this argument because it outweighs, because people rely less on these programs. Now let's go to their infrastructure argument. So first, let's dispel the notion, okay, there's three reasons why infrastructure will not pass. First off, if infrastructure does pass, there's no way that is green. As Noah points out, Trump does not believe in climate change and has a categorical opposition to any of these things. He doesn't even eat green food. He's not really a kind of green guy. He likes dirty and coal plants. That is his infrastructure plan. And in fact, Schumer and other leaders have themselves complained that they have put these stipulations of climate change things in the bills, and Trump has removed them from the bills. Two, even if this were true, there's funding impasses. Ever since Obama's days, they've been saying we will fund infrastructure, but there's always been funding complaints which have stopped it, even unified governments. And three, there's also no political trust. As the Washington Post explains, the fact that Democrats are going to start investigating Trump means that there's not going to be any infrastructure bill. Now let's go to their impacts. First on this idea of green tech jobs. Infrastructure investments do not create jobs generally. The reason why is because there's a lack of high-skilled workers, so they have to move workers around from old projects. That's why even in the New Deal, when we had a massive amount of infrastructure investment, there was no net decrease in unemployment. Unemployment never went below 14%. Then they say that there's environmental benefits. The Vox News explains that actually carbon capture does not reduce emissions, and the reason why is because it only stops emissions from new emissions. It does not take emissions that are already in the sky. So there's no net solvency there. Yeah. Thank you, and please affirm.
You were actually on task.
I can have the first one? Okay. Sure, thank you.
guy.
Thanks. So, I want to talk about the thing you read in rebuttal, that infrastructure is the core and delivering wealth to the bottom. Is that because infrastructure creates jobs, or are there other reasons? What are the other reasons?
Because, for example, if you have more low-income housing projects, you reduce or increase the accessibility for low-income housing projects.
Oh, okay.
If
So
you
sorry.
improve transportation, you allow the poor people to get to their jobs.
Sorry,
more easily.
I didn't hear that in the case. Just to establish, you're
Yeah,
saying
so that was the
infrastructure-
thing that I read at the end of my, the beginning of my rebuttal that you just wanted to.
Wait, where did you say that they build it in low-income housing neighborhoods? I thought you were talking about the Green Deal.
You know, so the thing I read at the beginning of my rebuttal was an indication that the opportunity cost of reducing debt is also general infrastructure. And general infrastructure is things like improving bridges, roads,
Okay, so
like
now,
schools,
okay, so
education.
cool. So now that I understand that benefit, well, let's talk about that.
Right.
So to win that argument, you have to win that infrastructure is built in areas that need it, right?
No.
Yes, if it's not, if it's
Because
built
like,
in wealthy areas, then
inherently a railroad
doesn't
isn't
help.
built in one place, right? It is rather built across
Alright.
pieces. Public transportation, for
Alright,
example,
public
isn't built in
transportation
one
is a
place.
great example.
I would tell you that
Okay.
like
public transportation is a great example of the waste of infrastructure spending. For example, I live in New York, and the subways in New York are terrible.
I got lost
Yet de
once.
Blasio has, but de Blasio hasn't spent any new, or mayor has not spent any new money fixing the subways.
Yeah.
He's building new subway stations in rich
Right.
areas.
So our argument is the alternative to not building, or even like what. So my question to you then would be, what do you do to promote infrastructure spending publicly,
What do I do to
like the affirmative?
Oh, okay, with the affirmative does.
You're
Sorry.
gonna
I was about to say, like, I'll pay taxes next year.
Okay. You're gonna classify the crying out argument, right? But our fundamental like thesis of argumentation here, right, is that if you affirm the resolution, there is necessarily no new infrastructure because you can't have any money to do so. So the risk of some infrastructure trickling down and helping anyone is a risk of offense we have that
It's
we
not,
uniquely
it's
have.
not a risk of offense.
It
As
is,
I've
though.
explained, even in the height of the New Deal, when we were doing things like the Hoover Dam, unemployment never went below 14%.
But like, no, we're not. Okay, so our benefits are some are tailored to unemployment, but even more so, the CNT evidence concludes that across the United States, empirically, in cities that have increased infrastructure projects, they've reduced poverty by 25% because you
I'm just-
increase the
I'm
wealth
just saying-
distribution at the bottom.
I'm saying that
These are just
I'm
like
saying that all
academic
those,
journals
I'm saying
that
that all
conclude.
those shiny trains and bridges are concentrated in wealthy areas who have more control
So
over the
can
government.
you explain to me then, coherently, as to why our evidence concludes that it helps the poor?
No,
So our
I
evidence
can't
is just
say-
wrong then?
No, look, we have contrasting evidence, so I'm trying to settle this on the warrant debate, right? And the
Exactly,
warranting,
right.
the warranting is that politicians respond to the incentives of high tax-paying wealthier citizens, and that as a result, infrastructure generally tends to go towards wealthier areas. I
But-
gave the personal example of New York.
That's like mitigation, right? Because it's not terminal defense to our argument. That's what I'm getting
So
at.
what is the size of your impact?
So the size of our impact is a 25% reduction in poverty, 1.5 million jobs, which are
But-
twice as likely
okay.
to be high paying,
But
and even more
that-
so on the climate change
But
argument.
that impact assumes that every new infrastructure thing is spent in
The
areas.
bill
that need it.
also specifies that you improve on old infrastructure.
Oh, yeah, well, we'll talk about that.
So we will,
Yeah. 2 minutes till
yeah, we have 2 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay, more on that.
There's 16 seconds left. Now the time.
with the second contention, and then the underview, and then their case.
It's
The
just
underview is just whatever Shri read at the bottom. You all ready?
Yeah.
Starting off from the second contention, they say that Trump will never let it happen, but we have two pieces of evidence that both indict this claim. The first one is that the Green New Deal has massive popular support. 54% of even conservative Republicans agree that the new Green Deal is a good form of infrastructure policy. That ultimately means that there's no political fallout for Republicans who switch sides on this bill, and it all in turn means that there's an increased chance of it passing in the status quo. Also recognize that the next piece of evidence indicates that Trump is willing to compromise, which ultimately means that Trump is not going to stay his course, because he has said over and over and over again that he wants to increase infrastructure spending. The only way Democrats are going to let this happen is if he provides space for green infrastructure and climate change infrastructure within that bill. That ultimately means that there's a 100% chance that this green infrastructure bill will include that, and you can extend the second impact that they drop. It indicates that the Journal of Environmental Management evidence indicates that green infrastructure has a laundry list of avenues to combat climate change, and one of them is carbon sequestration, the literal act of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere that's able to reduce emissions by 1/5 over the long term, which ultimately means that we can stop climate change in its tracks, and it additionally means that we are the only ones who are able to stop the Boltzmann evidence, which indicates that it causes the planet to literally become uninhabitable because the climate change causes rising sea levels and makes it literally so hot that we can't live on the planet of Earth. Moving on to the underview. Recognize that there's a general trade-off with infrastructure spending and spending on decreasing the debt. You literally cannot increase infrastructure or even keep it the same if you want to decrease the debt. That ultimately means that you have to cut infrastructure spending. That ultimately makes the economy less stable because there's less of these public jobs that people can access very easily. That ultimately decreases the safety nets of jobs that people can go to if they become unemployed. Moving on to their side. Recognize that bonds are always safer than investing in companies. Literally no investor will ever say, I'm going to give up on the federal government and invest in private companies, simply because the investing in the government is simply a safer investment. You can invest in Apple, however, they might release a series of trash products that you don't want to buy.
Was it just me or was it just me or was that dog shit? Was it just me or was that dog shit?
Alright, Alright. Our evidence indicates that the more debt that there is, that means that investors, whether it be you, me, and average Joe, or foreign investors, buy more U.S. bonds. That means they are not making productive investments in the economy on things like cars or investing in a business. That is really important because our CBO evidence indicates that this crowding out effect will reduce GDP by 15% over the next 10 years, and as a result, the St. Louis Fed says that each 1% decrease in GDP decreases employment by 2%. Their only response is that bonds are safe investments. That is not responsive to our link, because if the debt is lower, that means we are selling less bonds, and as a result, people make more investment in the economy. That is what spurs economic growth. But remember, if there's more debt, people buy more bonds, the trade-off exists. Winning us this argument wins the round for a few reasons. One, on scope, because our argument is about 15% GDP. That is far greater than any infrastructure benefit they talk about on scope, and the more time goes on, the worse crowding out gets, so it compounds forever. Infrastructure short term. But two, it also means that we win infrastructure, because insofar in the long term as the federal government has more revenue, that means they are more likely, they have A, more money to spend on infrastructure, but B, because there is more money, there's less disagreements over the budget, which are what is making the impasses happen right now. With that, let's go to their case specifically on infrastructure. They dropped Daniel's third response, which is that there's just no trust between Democrats and Republicans right now. We are literally in a shutdown. Their evidence about compromises from a few months ago, and insofar as that is true, there's no way an infrastructure bill will pass. Also, Trump will not pass an infrastructure bill. The only thing that Trump has done is promote pro-growth policies like funding new coal plants, which as a result which hurts the environment even more. Insofar as that is true, an infrastructure bill will never pass. And at the bottom, finally, even if you don't want to believe that, remember that things like infrastructure just don't create any jobs, because the amount of people who are hired from infrastructure is a finite number. All those jobs are already gone. They just be moving them around. There's no new employment. Also, they just invest in wealthy areas like the Q train on the Upper East Side, and that is why we affirm.
Are you all ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so why does the government shutdown mean that Trump's not going to compromise?
Well, I mean, the government shutdown was pretty terrible for political compromise.
Yeah, I get that, but it's over, so why does it still matter?
Well, no, I mean, first off, it's only temporarily over.
Okay, temporarily.
Like Trump, the first thing that Trump said.
Also, wait, just our evidence indicates the Washington Post. It's not just about the shutdown. It's that the fact that like the Democrats are going to start investigating Trump for crimes. I don't want to work with someone who might like lock me up in jail. Like that's.
Yeah,
that's
okay.
That's
Come
going
on,
to
come
happen
on now,
regardless of whichever
If you
side,
work
right?
with-
Our argument is, which is
Yeah, trust us.
So we
Like,
agree.
if you like work with Trump on passing an infrastructure bill, you're not going to get locked up for collusion with Russia, right? Like,
No, the point is the point is that Republicans and Democrats don't trust each other now more than ever, which is
So
why
why
an
did they end the
infrastructure bill
shutdown?
won't pass. Because workers around the
They
country.
ended the shutdown because Pelosi is awesome and kept the Democrats in reign.
Yeah, exactly,
and forced
right?
Trump to
Because
control.
because they had a compromise, which fundamentally answers back all of your trust arguments. The government stopped shutting down because the Republicans wanted something.
I
the
mean, it's
Democrats
hardly.
wanted
Hold
something,
on.
and they
It was
compromised.
hardly.
That is fundamentally
It was hardly a
both
compromise.
parties working together.
Wait, look, it's quite comfortable to say that like reopening the government is the same thing as passing a bill, right? They had to reopen the government at some point,
But
but
it's
wait, but the passage of a bill is a positive thing. Like Trump was
Like this-
losing support from his
and
base.
this is-
He
this
loses
is-
support if he doesn't pass
This
it.
is the other thing, is that our argument is that political trust right now is at an all-time low. If we could not pass an infrastructure bill when Obama controlled both the House and the Senate, and when Trump controlled both the House and the Senate, there was much less opposition. There's no reason we would pass one now. Do you want to ask a question?
sure, I will. I guess.
He just doesn't have a question. When he's on, yeah.
Okay, so let's just clarify our link. So
Wait, yeah. Okay,
so I'll ask the question about our link.
Okay.
So if the debt goes up, more people have to invest in U.S.
Wrong,
bonds, right?
because affirming doesn't necessarily mean you reduce the debt right away. That means that the bonds you talk about still exist.
Wait, no, because to reduce the debt, the federal government repays those bonds, right?
Exactly,
They sell them.
even-
Daniel, but
even
you
if
know
it's
you
long
can't
term-
pay $22 trillion
Well,
worth
no,
of
so
bonds,
Sri,
or even $18 trillion
we
worth of
agree,
bonds.
and even if, well, first new response, but second, even if it's in the long term, that is still money that eventually goes back into the economy, so that shouldn't really matter.
No, but I'm telling you that the rate at which your impact happens is severely mitigated because the amount of bonds that are decreasing on the market is super slow. Like you can't just unless you
Okay,
concede.
this is a new response.
What
though.
response?
Wait, no,
Isaac's not saying
Isaac
that.
literally tells you that bonds are always safer. That means because bonds are always safer, they don't go away right away.
No.
Wait, that's like, no.
Yeah.
Isaac's, hold on,
Yeah, that's
Isaac's
what I said.
response was that bonds are safe, so people always invest in bonds. You're doing a lot of extrapolating now.
Well,
What we
I
say
think it makes
is,
enough
like,
sense.
our argument has been pretty consistent and has not been responded to. The more bonds there are, the more investment in bonds there have to be and not in other things.
But
The
you
less
don't-
bonds you have when you reduce the debt, people invest in the economy.
The problem is you don't weigh that.
No, why is that piece away?
Roll, extend, or run our prep. We have like 20 seconds left. Yeah. Okay. Is everyone ready? Alright. Just gonna start off on infrastructure. there are two unique links we go for, one of which is completely conceded throughout the debate. That is, if you prioritize the debt reduction, you necessarily cannot invest in infrastructure. This has not been answered back throughout the entirety of the debate. At this point, you can pull through all of our access arguments about general trade-offs between infrastructure. Isaac clearly indicates that when you invest in infrastructure and overall, that there would be a decrease in the amount of jobs. That's why, historically and empirically, investing in infrastructure creates 1.5 million jobs, which are twice as likely to be high-paying. Empirically, the CNT evidence corroborates that poverty was decreased by 25%, and for every $1 spent on infrastructure, you create $3 in economic output. These are impacts that they have not responded to. At the end of the day, the link on the generic infrastructure can also be applied to green infrastructure. These are two links, one of which is conceded, but even more so, we would tell you that voters care. The voter base of Republicans are shifting towards policies like green infrastructure. That's why it doesn't matter if Trump doesn't want it, because we would tell you that the other Republicans would compromise with Democrats. But even more so, Trump is just a short-term president. If you prioritize green infrastructure and economic growth over the long term, eventually there would be a different president and you would get bills through. They do nothing to access or even increase infrastructure. But then go on to the impact level. They have no impact defense. He just tells you that infrastructure is probably bad and there's no political trust. The problem with the political trust argument is that if the voter base is changing, this has been consistent, if the voter base is changing, the political trust does not matter because these Democrats and Republicans are able to reach compromise. That's what happened with the shutdown. Now on the impact level, there's no impact defense. Isaac literally tells you that carbon capture is taking carbon out of the air. That's what carbon sequestration is. That's why with 2020, we can reduce emissions by 1/5. Ultimately, we are telling you that millions of people die every year because of climate change. And if your climate change, it gets worse, we would tell you that all of their arguments about the private sector are actually turned because you can't invest into developing new technologies and invest into the private sector when your world is on fire and you have to deal with these huge issues of climate change. That's why we tell you that the existential threat comes first. Now on their case, recognize that we have told you on a comparative level, bonds are always safer than investing in other corporations. That means the decision-making calculus doesn't change. Ultimately, they also don't extend a clear impact as to what would happen in the private sector and what private sector investment is. But lastly, we would tell you that overall, bonds don't magically disappear just because you prioritize the debt. They still exist.
Is everyone ready? Okay. To begin, the reason why you can sign your balance for this vote is on the crowding out argument. And remember, that as the federal government reduces its debt, it sells back bonds to investors. That is money that they don't have to spend on paying down our debt, but can put into the economy. This answers my opponent's only response to our case, because even if debt is, obviously bonds are less risky, but they're selling them back, so there are less bonds available. So even if they wanted to invest in bonds, they're less available because we're reducing the debt. That gives us our link into reducing crowd out. Remember that the less money that can be spent on private investment means you have less economic growth. Less businesses have less money to create less jobs, and overall the CBO finds that there is a 15% drop in GDP over the next 10 years. Winning this argument wins us the round in two ways, which my opponents drop over. First, on scope, we say that a 15% GDP drop is more substantial than any of their impacts. Even their carbon capture impact, which may be somewhat successful, but they don't tell you the magnitude or how this actually solves for the entirety of climate change. But they really don't tell you how many jobs are created or how large the impact of infrastructure is. But second, it also links into their infrastructure argument. If you want infrastructure, the government should have more money to spend on that. And as the economy grows, revenue opens up to spend on infrastructure, and conversely, it means that we don't have to make any cuts. So that wins us their case. But here's why you shouldn't vote on their case. Let's go to the infrastructure debate. So first, we would say that infrastructure is just not going to happen. And the reason why is because, one, Republicans and Trump do not believe in climate change. That has been their institutional position, and it means that they are not going to support a bill that includes climate change measures. They say that voters care, but they never make the link between voters and politicians changing their minds. Their evidence doesn't either. The evidence is literally just reading off poll data. If this were so true, then when the Republicans controlled both houses just last year, they would have passed a substantial infrastructure bill. We also say that because political trust is so low, even if voters want this, because Democrats and Republicans just do not trust each other and cannot cooperate, because they barely open the government, there just is not room to pass infrastructure. Our evidence post-states theirs on the fact that we cannot pass this bill, which means that there is no probability of an infrastructure bill being passed, and they don't access their impacts. But even if you want to vote on their impact about job creation, what we say is infrastructure is not the best way to create jobs, because A, infrastructure goes towards wealthy areas, so it doesn't help the poor, and B, does not create net jobs because of a dearth of skills. That is why we encourage you to vote for the protein. Thank you.